So, it's been a year since the Titanic Honour and Glory 10-year retrospective video essay, and the reaction to that video was just pretty awesome, also pretty unexpected. You know, hugely positive reaction. I think people took it the way it was intended. I think people got a lot from it and continue to. I also got a lot of weird comments though. You know, there were people saying like, I bet there's not even coffee in that mug. And I mean, you're right, there wasn't coffee in that mug. There was gin. But I mean, no, like, in all seriousness, it was a video that I wasn't going to do. I had almost talked myself out of it, but you know, I'm glad I did it. I don't think it harmed the project in any way, and I don't think it harmed me in any way. It didn't exactly like make my channel blow up the way that some people might have assumed it did, but it was a fun video to make, and the response that it continues to get is pretty cool. But I thought I would follow that video up on the 1-year anniversary with a intellectual video. Now I would like to present to you an essay that I wrote in 2020. It was during the first lockdown. I wrote the script for this video. I published it on medium.com, and I wrote it because there was nothing else to do. And I know for some people, writing an extremely long, multiple page essay isn't exactly their idea of like killing time, curing boredom, having fun. But I like writing, and I had a lot on my mind. You know, there was just, I needed an outlet. Writing an essay is what I did. But then I thought, you know, COVID will end and there's going to be no point even bringing this up again. Sadly, 2 years later, COVID's like just as relevant as it was then. So I thought, why not bring it out, dust it off a bit, edit some of the numbers because obviously some things have changed, and turn it into a video essay. Because I think the sentiment of the script is still relevant. You know, the message of it. And we're still kind of in the middle of a pandemic, so yeah. So without further ado, I would just like to thank you for checking this video out. And if you enjoy the video or have enjoyed my previous videos and stuff, feel free to like, comment, share. I've never said this in a video yet. Feels kind of strange to say it, but here we are. Enjoy. As a self-professed Titanic enthusiast, gripped by the 1997 Hollywood movie as a child, and hooked by the real story ever since, I've spent much of my time for the last 17 years studying the ship, the sinking, the people involved, and even creating art based around the tragedy. In all that time, I've often wondered why the world is still fascinated and captivated by the story of Titanic. Even if it's on a lesser level than my own interest, which it usually is, there's no denying that Titanic truly was unsinkable when it comes to legend and imagination. And even when I pretty much knew the answer as to why she's still so omnipresent, or could nearly put my finger on it, I always found it hard to put into words. It's not so much the story, although that in itself is a huge part of it, but rather I think it's the lessons to be learned. Yes, there are the lessons learned in terms of safety regulations at sea, which were almost immediately altered to prevent such horror happening again, and to silence the justified worldwide outrage. To this day, every evacuation drill upon the first night of a luxury cruise, or the amount of lifeboats on board, is a direct result of the historic tragedy. But what about the broader societal lessons that were learned by the New World, which awoke with a shock on the morning of April 15th, 1912? People are still captivated by and reference the disaster in the year 2022, not only in pop culture, but in newspaper articles, political commentary, and the answer as to why that is has been made clearer to me now more than ever in my 17 years of Titanic obsession. The sinking of the RMS Titanic 110 years ago and the death of nearly 1,500 people continues to show the world of present day how vulnerable we are as a society, and how when suddenly thrust into an emergency situation, it's the most vulnerable and disempowered members of that society who end up suffering and sacrificing the most. Chivalry, heroism, and being a member of the Titanic's band which played on is all well and good, and these absolutely deserve recognition. The sheer amount of husbands, fathers, sons and brothers who died from all classes and creeds are another worthwhile conversation entirely. But let's look behind the curtain of drama, glamour and high society for just a moment. Because in the same way that newspapers gripped readers 110 years ago with the list of celebrity and aristocratic names who may or may not have survived the sinking, we too are being distracted by the media. Such stories as Captain Trump at the wheel of the SS Americana kept us bemused, and the weekly band of citizens who played on their pots and pans as their healthcare system and economy foundered drowned out the noise of protest and dissent from key workers who still want more lifeboats, more PPE. Titanic's key workers made up a massive percentage of those who perished. They were the ones who kept the ship's generators and furnaces tended to, which meant the passengers and crew on the boat deck had lights and the men in the smoking room had warmth. Titanic stokers and other crew members, those who weren't officers, very rarely get a mention. And whilst we applaud our own key workers today, it's very telling that a common phrase used since 1912 is, "and the band played on," rather than, "and the poor, filthy, sweating, exhausted men earning pennies stayed at their stations down in the bowels of a flooding ship for the benefit of those above, knowing they would drown." I guess the former does roll off the tongue better. And it's important to know that the wealthiest passengers, first in line to a lifeboat, had a string quartet playing cheerful tunes to ease their anxieties. Well, I would have had sleepless nights otherwise. Who wants to think of the poorest, lesser educated, worst treated members of Titanic's microcosm of society? It's uncomfortable and makes us think about broader issues that we ourselves potentially play a role in perpetuating or normalising. We'd rather point and shout at the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, in disgust as he steps into a lifeboat, abandoning his own doomed creation, leaving behind those who put their trust in him. But when it comes to Titanic's long-lasting impact, it's not due to the well-known names of the time caught up in the disaster, like that of Bruce Ismay, since most people in 2022 wouldn't really know who he or the Countess of Roths, John Jacob Astor, or Benjamin Guggenheim were. It can't be the romanticised and glamorised vignette that James Cameron so perfectly portrayed, since Titanic was well and truly engraved in the public psyche before 1997, and even before her seafloor wreck was discovered in 1985. Jack and Rose just made the story sexier than it had previously been. The largest factor which surely, but not solely, leads to the tragedy's longevity must be the tales of morality on board the Titanic that cold April morning, which deemed it a night to remember. What or what not to do, and when to do it, when the world around you is coming to an end. After all, one of the main points of studying history is to learn from the mistakes of the past and try never to repeat them. While we were busy debating whether or not Jack could have fit on the door next to Rose, and it's a section of wall, by the way, but whatever, or why the lifeboats weren't filled to their full capacity by untrained and inexperienced crew, we hadn't been educated in schools or in media about one of the biggest and most scandalous myths surrounding the tragedy. And to this day, I bet 9 out of 10 people don't know that it's false. Remember those heart-wrenching scenes in James Cameron's film of the Irish mother with the messy red hair and her 2 adorable little children gazing at their mother for reassurance? With wide-eyed innocence, they ask her when it will be their turn to go up to the lifeboats. as crew members guard the locked metal gates and tell the growing crowd of worried third-class passengers through the iron bars to be patient. Rough and ready third-class men shake the gates and demand to be let out, but the crew stand their ground and keep the gates locked. The Irish mother reassures her children, saying that first class are first to get into the lifeboats, of course, and then it will be their turn in no time. But she glares up at the crew members, and we see in her worried eyes that even she knows how this story ends. The idea that third-class passengers were locked down in the lower decks of a sinking ship behind big black wrought iron gates like flea-ridden rats is an absolute lie. Only one third-class passenger ever claimed that they were intentionally locked below decks, a Norwegian survivor named Olos Jorgensen Abelseth. In his initial testimonies and letters written by him on board the rescue ship Carpathia, he doesn't mention this aspect of the night's events at all. However, he later went on to get a job as a speaker on film sets as movies became the next hot commodity. So much so, the first film of the disaster was made and released less than a month after the sinking, and even starred first-class survivor Dorothy Gibson. Olos Jorgensen Abelseth was what we might refer to now as a consultant on these productions, giving the writers, actors and director some first-hand accounts to enrich their material and lend a sense of gravitas to their silent movies. This rumour of third-class passengers being trapped below decks as the ship sank didn't begin circulating until about 1915, and it was soon being shown on the silver screen for audiences to see. It might have added to the drama and highlighted the class disparities in a more cinematic way, but it just never happened. Actually, the White Star Line was known for treating third class very well, if not better than most other shipping companies, since steerage and immigrant passengers made up such a large portion of their ticket sales, and really were the bread and butter of most transatlantic travel. Third class passengers were actually encouraged by the White Star Line to report any stewards who showed prejudice towards them or treated them poorly. Families were travelling in huge groups at this time, emigrating to America, and sometimes the men of the family would travel out first to find a job before sending for the rest of his family to follow. It was just good business sense on the White Star Line's part. If you treat your third class passengers, the largest portion of your ship's capacity, well, and they enjoy their experience, then they would tell their friends and family to travel by White Star Line. And then they would tell their friends, and so on, so on. So if third class passengers weren't prevented from boarding the lifeboats, and they weren't forced to stay in their cabins and drown, then why did so many of Titanic's third class passengers lose their lives on April 15th, 1912? Mostly it was due to Titanic's own virus control measures. This was in reaction to a huge cholera outbreak amongst immigrant passengers in the early 1890s, and subsequently much stricter third class quarantines on board ships. To prevent a possible cholera outbreak on an already sinking ship, their evacuation had to be planned, thought out and methodical. Sadly, their evacuation was disorganised, slow and confused, which no doubt led to so many deaths of the less privileged classes on board Titanic. But they were not prevented from going to the boat deck. And whilst a vaccine for cholera was finally approved in 2016, there's yet to be a vaccine for class inequality and the higher prices that the poorest in our society pay as a result. When it comes to the sinking of Titanic and the actions and decisions of her passengers and crew, there are many myths, falsehoods and misunderstandings surrounding it. But what can we learn in the year 2022 from a sinking that truly changed the world in 1912? So far, it seems that we've learned the Titanic tragedy makes for an incredibly convenient and seemingly comprehensive metaphor, ideal for clickbait style news articles and opinion pieces. And in the last 2 years, it has been used to no end when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic. With one very simple internet search, typing the keywords Titanic, COVID-19, lifeboats, coronavirus into the search bar, you'll be able to find numerous news segments and articles which mention the sinking of the Titanic in order to highlight points and draw parallels between the infamous sinking and the current situation. Dr. Lynn Webster wrote for Pain News Network an article titled "Why Coronavirus is a Modern Day Titanic." Sumitra Nair wrote for The Week a piece in which she states, "Opinion: Why COVID-19 pandemic in India is similar to sinking of Titanic." Jennifer Schaefer, writing for The Guardian, "The wealthy and powerful are counting on us not paying attention. They're looking out for their own while we're left on a sinking ship." Not to mention an article about panic buying, in which Stephen Taylor writes for the BBC, "If everyone else on the Titanic is running for the lifeboats, you're going to run too, regardless if the ship's sinking or not." The comparisons are everywhere, and they always have been. Titanic has been used as an exemplar of what society can do right and what it can do wrong ever since 1912. But I don't think there's ever been a time since then, not to my knowledge anyway, where every week multiple articles are written for news columns and political sites across the globe, all comparing the current state of affairs to the infamous sinking. Titanic is inescapable at the moment. It's everywhere. But is it an appropriate comparison? 3 of the 4 article examples that I just gave touch upon the less privileged, more vulnerable and marginalised factions in society who suffered back in 1912 aboard Titanic, and in the exact same way are being expected to suffer today. The sinking of the Titanic made it clearer than ever how lower classes were seen as disposable by most. And even if there were people who didn't see them as disposable, or companies treat them well because their custom was so crucial to their bottom line, the reality remained that they were still the ones working the most grueling jobs on these large, luxurious liners. And when it all goes wrong, of course they're going to be the last ones up onto the boat deck. The stokers in the boiler rooms and the engineers keeping the Titanic's lights burning bright had a job to do. And almost all of them stayed at their posts until the bitter end. Some people act as if the coronavirus pandemic looming over the world at the moment has only now made these key workers vulnerable, and that they're dying because they're working in hospitals and nursing homes, the jobs most people don't willingly want to do. However, there's more to it than job risk levels. These people aren't just vulnerable because they're key workers. On the whole, and as is becoming more and more apparent, they're key workers because they're vulnerable. Here in Britain, there was an alarming rate of immigrant, black, minority and marginalised groups dying of COVID-19 when all of this began. No surprise then, although to some it still is, that the majority of NHS and social care staff are immigrants, black, minority and marginalised groups. We can't let our vulnerable, a lot of them now known as key workers, to become the new example of Titanic's third class. But the thing is, they already are, and they always have been. The last 2 years have just made it far more obvious. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's new is the virus. That's why the cheers and applause for key workers every Thursday night left me with a strange feeling. I don't feel it's good enough to show compassion when they're dying, because there was very little compassion shown while they were living. I think their lives, whilst they're alive to live them, being improved in wages, healthcare, education, and therefore future prospects and the chance of working less grueling jobs, would be far better. We all knew third-class citizens were the last priority when it came to every aspect of life in 1912, and we only cried out when 76% of them died on a ship's maiden voyage. Their poor diets, non-existent medicine, and inadequate hygiene and plumbing facilities meant they would die long before most of their first and second class peers. It's no different today. So with all of this said, I want to put an opinion forward that I think many people may disagree with, or feel is rather abstract. But given everything I see on the news each night and in online articles, not to mention the extensive knowledge I have of a tragedy from over a century ago, I hope people will understand the sentiment of what I'm about to say. Titanic's passengers weren't denied lifeboats because they were third class. They were third class because they were denied lifeboats. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, to put it plainly, the worldwide outrage came only after the sinking of Titanic. Beforehand, these people were just passengers. They were immigrants, workers, stokers, crew. They were people. Then, April 15th, 1912 came along, and suddenly, with the news of Titanic's sinking, these people became the third class. In the same way that nowadays we have key workers. They became a collective entity which symbolised oppression and involuntary self-sacrifice. Titanic's third class became a cautionary tale of mythic proportions for the world to use as a metric of injustice and inequality. And now we have our own class of oppressed self-sacrificers. And just like the third class in 1912, key workers have always been there. Now that they're dying, we finally see them. So whilst I understand the Titanic pandemic metaphors and similes, and I'm a big fan of a good visual metaphor, I think it's extremely important as well to see the major differences. After April 15th, 1912, lessons were learned from the mistakes made. Has there ever been another sinking on the level of Titanic? No, because of Titanic. Lives were lost, changes were made, and travelling by ship became immensely safer, and has only gotten safer to this day as a direct result of Titanic's sinking. Painting the historical figures on the Titanic 110 years ago with these broad strokes of good, bad, evil, hero simplifies a human tragedy of real nuance and decision making to the point of diminishing the significance and reality of it. Comparing our politicians and leaders to these black and white stereotypical archetypal caricatures that have emerged since 1912 gives our presidents and prime ministers a pass that in many respects I feel they don't deserve. Bruce Ismay, chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, faced immense backlash for even daring to survive the Titanic disaster. But he knew exactly what changes had to be made to prevent another Titanic-scale disaster ever happening again at sea. The world needs transparency, now more than ever. If those in power know we're sinking, all because they ignored the warnings of ice fields up ahead, and they hide it from us, it's unacceptable. They heat the economy's engines to full speed, only to have them crash to a jarring halt. And while we're sinking, there still aren't enough lifeboats for everyone on board, despite them having the past 110 years to fix these glaring problems. When Titanic's master shipbuilder, Thomas Andrews, finished assessing the iceberg damage to the starboard side of the ship's keel, he worked out the calculations in his head. Knowing the ship would sink in roughly 2 hours, it sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. The lifeboats were launched, and women and children eventually started boarding them to evacuate the ship. Third-class stewards and a few designated crewmen were tasked with bringing third-class passengers upstairs in small groups to enter lifeboats. The last thing anyone wanted were the surviving first and second class passengers to arrive in New York with cholera. Gates weren't locked, and the third class weren't ignored. I'm not defending all of the actions taken or decisions made that morning by Captain Smith and his crew. I'm simply presenting the facts and events as they happened, because they have been forgotten, misunderstood and distorted with time. Our history lessons in school have come to be filled with centuries-old fake news. The decision to fill the lifeboats with less than half of their capacity was a shocking action to take. A lifeboat with room for 60 people left the ship with only 12 on board. If they had all been filled to capacity, nearly 500 extra lives could have been saved. Just some of those empty seats could have been used to save the 53 children who died, for instance. But even in loading the lifeboats less than half full, the crew's reasoning was a lack of training and understanding when it came to the lifeboats. And this was true. It wasn't just an excuse they made after the fact, when the heat was put onto the surviving crewmen at the inquiry into the sinking. There was no lifeboat drill. Most of them didn't know the lifeboat's maximum capacity, or even if the boats could handle the weight of more than 30 people. Not to mention the fact that many people weren't even willing to get on them. Lack of lifeboat training and misguided attempts of organised third-class evacuation do not equate to doctors and nurses being sent to work in COVID-19 wards with inadequate or in some cases non-existent PPE, even after a staggering amount of doctors and nurses have died from COVID-19. A freak accident at sea does not translate to civilians being told it's safe to go back outside to work and spend money, despite death tolls continuing to rise, by lawmakers and elected officials who are still working from home, communicating these messages of reopening the economy via the safety of their webcams. A businessman directly responsible for a ship's creation, not its sinking, being told to enter a lifeboat by a ship's officer is not the same as the largest upward transfer of wealth in American history going to the CEOs of the biggest corporations, whilst 25% of Americans were unemployed and had lost their healthcare coverage as a result, causing suicide rates to skyrocket. Bruce Ismay wasn't evil, and he didn't dress as a woman or quietly sneak into a lifeboat as was widely reported by the media at the time. He helped men, women and children enter lifeboats, and Titanic's first officer, William Murdoch, more or less demanded that Ismay board one of the last lifeboats. And only when there were no more women and children in that immediate area left to assist did Ismay oblige. Titanic was gone just 20 minutes later. Figures of public outrage, as well as weaponised media coverage to help vent said outrage following a tragedy, whether it's deserved or not, is something we see today in very similar ways to Ismay's plight. Here in the UK, we had Dominic Cummings, advisor to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who broke lockdown rules, the very rules he helped to devise at the height of the pandemic, and drove a 60-mile round trip to test his eyesight on a day trip to a scenic castle ruin, which also happened to take place on his wife's birthday, coincidentally. There was outrage, not only over his actions, since he may have only broke the spirit of the rules, but his lack of apology and his apparent smug attitude towards the media and the public. Cummings did not resign, and Johnson defended him, saying he wouldn't be fired. All of this after Britain obeyed the rules of lockdown and sacrificed so much in order to help prevent the spread of the virus. Dominic Cummings went from being a largely unknown figure to a household name overnight, and one of Britain's most hated people at that. A little over a year after Titanic's sinking, Bruce Ismay resigned as chairman of the White Star Line, but continued to assist with the efforts and distribution of the Titanic Relief Fund, which was set up to compensate the most impacted survivors of the tragedy. Ismay, a wealthy businessman, was criticised for surviving while so many perished. But so was Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller. Lightoller was criticised despite performing his duty until the bitter end, almost drowning after he jumped from the sinking boat deck and nearly freezing to death as he climbed aboard an overturned lifeboat. He spent the morning commanding it as it slowly sank, pulling aboard people struggling in the water until the rescue ship Carpathia arrived. He was the most senior officer to survive the sinking, and despite his efforts, the mere fact that he was alive instantly painted him in a negative light in the eyes of the public. By all accounts, he should have died, but through luck or divine intervention, he survived. Ismay and Lightoller broke some kind of unwritten, unspoken, but unshakable rule, which says you must die, especially if you're a rich male, for it's the honourable thing to do. And of course, I understand the implications of Ismay's survival, but is this fair? The British inquiry into the sinking didn't think so. saying that adding another death to the already huge toll serves no one. If these two men had died, 1,496 others would still be dead alongside them. The idea of dying purely to save face and avoid being seen as dishonourable is an intense and sombre ideology, and one that I don't think anyone would adhere to today. At the time, the only person expected to perish in a shipwreck, rightly or wrongly, was the captain, who must always go down with his ship. Titanic's captain, Edward John Smith, fulfilled that unspoken promise. But 1912 was a different time, where a captain willingly dies, even if it's just to avoid scrutiny and shame. Almost exactly 100 years after Titanic sank, the cruise ship Costa Concordia was run aground and began to sink, and its own captain, Francesco Schettino, evacuated the ship before anyone else. He left everyone to fend for themselves, resulting in 32 passengers and crew dying. He received a 16-year prison sentence. In the current situation, I see the people who are supposed to keep us safe, our elected officials and government bodies worldwide, being compared to misrepresented ghosts of the past. I see the current unfolding scenarios being contrasted against broadly generalised and often false ideas of the Titanic disaster, which is something that has always happened and will always happen. However, I personally don't think the comparisons hold water. I think what happened in 1912 was terrible, but I think much of what's happening now is a lot worse. What happened in 1912 was an accident. Much of what's happening today is not only preventable, but is also intentional. I see presidents, prime ministers, governors and mayors across the world committing acts that they portray as being in the best interest of their people, or skirting around hard-hitting questions with answers that evade any real substance or clarity. These people had time to prepare and chose not to. They saw what was coming and did nothing. They knew we were all in a fragile bubble, and they knew it would burst when a pandemic inevitably hit. No one in 1912 thought Titanic would sink as quickly as she did, and many thought she wouldn't sink at all. That might seem naive and absurd to us in the year 2022, but like I said, 1912 was a different time. No one nowadays would shame or scald a ship's officers, be them from a cruise ship or a naval vessel, for innocently and miraculously surviving a tragic sinking. And experts nowadays, as cruise ships get larger and lifeboat davits still can't lower lifeboats when a ship is listing more than 20 degrees, all agree that a modern day Titanic disaster isn't only probable, it's inevitable. Using the name Titanic to draw loose parallels grabs people's attention, which is what makes it so great for an article headline. The story has reached biblical proportions by this point, but we're boiling down real people who made real decisions and lived real lives up and down the class structure to their most base form. Therefore, the metric doesn't work, in my opinion, because the reasoning behind a lot of what happened on April 15th, 1912 is lost. The comparisons are surface level, and I feel they do the victims of Titanic sinking, as well as bus drivers, grocery store staff, and healthcare workers who have died from COVID-19 today, a disservice. The Titanic disaster has been used to describe multiple hierarchical societal failures, big business bailouts, and class crises over the last century. But there's only ever been one Titanic. The coronavirus pandemic should never have happened, or at least not on the mass worldwide scale that it has happened. We've already had our Titanic moment in terms of infectious disease pandemics. Spanish flu, SARS, MERS, and any one of them should have been enough to learn the lessons that we needed to. Not to mention the multiple mock scenarios. The 2016 exercise Cygnus here in the UK, for example, where governments, healthcare systems and the pillars of society itself were rigorously and hypothetically tested with the inevitable moment when we would face a rampant contagious virus. These tests happened years ago, and they showed that developed Western society was not prepared for a potential global pandemic. There were undeniable facts, inexcusable shortcomings, dire warnings, and we ignored them. If we expected it to happen and knew we had to prepare, why didn't we? No one told Captain Smith and his crew that they would absolutely hit an iceberg and sink in less than 3 hours. We, however, were absolutely told in no uncertain terms that we would definitely experience a pandemic exactly like we're experiencing now. We were told this years before 2020, and we were told how to prepare and how to minimise the impacts, and we did nothing. Many people don't know this, but Titanic actually had more lifeboats on board when she sank than was required by law for a ship of her size. She had 20 lifeboats, but was only required to have 16. And even if she had enough lifeboats on board to evacuate everyone, the end result wouldn't have been any different. The first lifeboat wasn't lowered until 1 hour after the iceberg collision, meaning they only had another hour and 40 minutes to get the others away, under the assumption that the ship would sink in 2 hours. So, as far as they knew, they only had an hour to get the other 19 lifeboats safely away. In the end, the last 4 lifeboats were washed off of the boat deck as it went under, one of them upside down, and one of them found days later with frozen bodies inside. So whilst having lifeboats aboard for everyone is of course the ideal scenario, it's only ideal if you have enough time to execute this. In reality, preparing and lowering the lifeboats was a slow, disorganised and chaotic mess. After her sinking, Titanic's nearly identical sister ship Olympic's boat deck was entirely fitted out with lifeboats, providing more than enough capacity for everyone on board. And their younger sister ship Titanic, which became a hospital ship in World War I, was fitted with huge electrical davits which could lower multiple lifeboats at the same time, which was cutting-edge technology in its day. The White Star Line, and subsequently every other shipping company, learned their lesson after April 15th, 1912. When will we learn our lesson?